I never thought living in a quiet, oceanfront neighborhood would turn into a battle for my own property. One morning, I woke up to an official notice from the HOA claiming they were seizing my $3 million oceanfront property. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, but the tone of the letter left no room for doubt. Every clause, every demand felt like a personal attack, as if the very ground beneath my feet didn't belong to me anymore. I had spent years building this home, this sanctuary, and suddenly, some self-righteous HOA official was trying to take it away. And then came the moment that changed everything. I realized they had no idea who they were messing with. I'm not just a homeowner. I'm the sheriff, the law in this town, and suddenly the rules weren't what they seemed. But could I stop them in time, or was my paradise about to vanish forever? Before the chaos began, life in my oceanfront community was as peaceful as it could get. My mornings were filled with the gentle rhythm of waves crashing against the shore, the salty breeze drifting through the open windows of my home, and the distant calls of seabirds greeting the sunrise. I had spent years building not just a house, but a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world, where every detail reflected the life I had worked so hard to create. From the polished wooden floors to the sun-drenched patio overlooking the endless expanse of blue water. It was my dream realized, a private corner of paradise where I could unwind, host friends, and feel the freedom that comes with owning something truly your own. Neighbors waved politely as they walked their dogs along the winding paths that traced the cliffs. And there was a sense of calm, a rhythm to life that made the HOA rules seem like a minor inconvenience at most. The Homeowners Association at the time felt like a background detail, a layer of paperwork and regulations that existed to maintain order, nothing more. Their meetings, which I attended rarely, were formalities I barely noticed, filled with discussions about landscaping guidelines, painting restrictions, or fence heights. I had even joked once with a friend that the HOA was like a silent guardian of our little paradise, making sure everything stayed neat and picturesque. Little did I know how quickly that perception would change. Life had its small dramas, of course. Occasionally, a neighbor would push a boundary or complain about something trivial, and the HOA would respond with stern letters or fines. Usually, these incidents were minor, resolved quietly, and forgotten. But in hindsight, these were the earliest hints of the undercurrent that would eventually surface. An obsession with control, with enforcing rules to the point of absurdity, and a willingness to target anyone who dared to stand out or push back. At the time, it was easy to dismiss it as petty bureaucracy. I had always been a law-abiding resident, careful to follow every guideline, pay every fee, and maintain my property exactly as required. My home was not just a place to live. It was a reflection of who I was, a symbol of hard work, determination, and freedom. I took pride in the small details, the way the garden bloomed with vibrant colors in spring, the careful maintenance of the deck that overlooked the water, the way the sunlight hit the living room just right in the late afternoon. I was meticulous, not because the HOA demanded it, but because I genuinely loved the space I had created. And that love, I would soon discover, made me a target. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A letter appeared one morning, slipped under my door, with neat, impersonal lettering. At first glance, it seemed routine, a notice about a landscaping inspection. But there was something in the tone that felt sharp, almost accusatory. The HOA claimed that a minor modification I had made to my property, a custom-built pergola overlooking the water, violated some obscure guideline. I thought it was a misunderstanding, something that could be cleared up with a quick phone call. But when I tried to reach out, the response was cold, almost dismissive. They weren't interested in discussion, they were interested in enforcement. Then came the neighbors. A few who had once seemed friendly now glanced at me with thinly veiled suspicion, whispering as they passed by, as though my very presence had become a provocation. I started noticing small things, letters pushed under my door late at night, complaints about noises or minor property details that seemed trivial yet were suddenly treated with the utmost seriousness. It was as if the HOA had begun to map my life, watching for any deviation from their strict rules, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The tension built incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first. Each interaction was a test, a probe to see how far I would tolerate interference in my life. There were fines for obscure infractions, emails that demanded immediate compliance, inspections that arrived unannounced. The absurdity of some of these demands was staggering. Paint colors questioned, garden layouts challenged, even the timing of a simple repair called into question. And yet, I kept my composure, responding politely, documenting every interaction, believing that reason and evidence would prevail over bureaucracy. What I didn't yet realize was that the HOA wasn't interested in reason. They were interested in control, in proving that no resident, no matter how respected or careful, could step outside the boundaries they imposed. And when someone with authority like me, a sheriff, someone accustomed to enforcing the law rather than bending to it, entered their crosshairs, they didn't anticipate the storm they were about to unleash. The first direct confrontation came unexpectedly. A letter, far more severe than the previous notices, arrived one morning in bold type. It claimed that my property was now in violation of multiple HOA rules and hinted at potential seizure if I failed to comply immediately. My heart sank for a moment, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Seizure. My home, my sanctuary, threatened by an association I had barely thought of as anything more than a formal council. The idea seemed ludicrous, yet the language was precise, legally framed, and undeniably threatening. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the letter, the morning sun glinting off the ocean just beyond my window. The beauty of the water, the tranquility I had always taken for granted, suddenly felt fragile, almost unreal. Could this really happen? Could some faceless organization truly attempt to take what I had built? That's when I realized that this was no longer a matter of petty complaints or minor disputes. This was a battle for ownership, for control, for respect. And more than anything, it was a test of whether I was willing to stand my ground, or let my life be dictated by people who had no real stake in it. And that's when the reality hit me. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I'm not just a homeowner, I'm the sheriff. I have authority, experience, and knowledge that far surpasses the rigid rules of an HOA. And while the notice itself was intimidating, it sparked something else, a determination to protect my home at all costs. But could I act quickly enough to counter their moves without escalating the situation beyond repair? Or was this just the beginning of a conflict that would spiral far beyond what I had ever imagined when I first moved to this idyllic stretch of oceanfront paradise? Even as the tension began to mount, I tried to hold on to the calm rhythm of my life. Morning walks along the cliffside, evenings watching the sunset, the smell of salt in the air, all reminders of what I was fighting to protect. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The HOA's reach extended further than I realized, and the next weeks would test every ounce of patience, every strategic instinct, and every legal tool at my disposal. What began as a serene life by the sea was about to turn into a battle of wits, power, and sheer determination. A battle that no homeowner should ever have to fight, yet one that I was uniquely prepared to wage. And just as I thought I understood the scope of the conflict, the next notice arrived, escalated, direct, and threatening more than just fines. It hinted at seizure of my property, a move so audacious it seemed impossible. I held the letter in my hands, feeling the weight of every word. Could a homeowners association truly challenge me in this way? And if they did, what would I be forced to do to defend what was mine? The tension didn't just build, it exploded, creeping into every corner of my life. What had started as a seemingly minor dispute over a pergola soon morphed into an endless barrage of letters, fines, inspections, and veiled threats. Each morning I awoke to new notices tucked under the door or shoved into my mailbox, their content growing increasingly aggressive. One day it was a warning about the angle of my driveway slope. Another day it was a citation for unauthorized landscaping. The absurdity of some of these claims was staggering. I meticulously documented everything, knowing that if this escalated further, I would need proof. But each interaction carried the weight of intimidation, the subtle suggestion that my autonomy was slipping through my fingers. Then the neighbors began to change. Those who had once waved politely now watched me with suspicion, whispering as they passed by, glances sharp, smiles forced. I started noticing subtle acts of sabotage. Garden hoses moved, personal property shifted, and lights left on to make it appear that I had violated HOA rules about energy use. It was small, petty, but deliberate, meant to unsettle me, and it worked. My sense of security, the one thing that had made this place a sanctuary, was eroding under the weight of constant scrutiny. I remember a particular day when the HOA called for an unannounced inspection. I had been working in the garden, my hands dirty, sweat running down my brow, when a representative appeared at the gate, clipboard in hand, expression cold and formal. He began inspecting every inch of my property, measuring fences, photographing patios, noting the angle of my sun deck. I asked politely if there were specific violations they were concerned about. He shook his head, mumbling about general compliance and future observations. I felt a wave of helplessness. There was no accusation, no clarity, just an omnipresent threat hovering over me like a dark cloud. And then came the fines. Small at first, barely noticeable, a few $100s here and there for minor infractions. But they mounted quickly, each one accompanied by a letter dripping with admonishment and warnings of worse consequences if I didn't comply. The financial pressure was real, but worse than the money was the psychological strain. Each notice, each fine, carried with it a message: you are not in control here. You are under scrutiny. You are expendable. I pored over the OA bylaws, searching for loopholes, for something, anything that would allow me to reclaim my freedom. The rules were dense, convoluted, written in legalese that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate rather than clarify. Meanwhile, neighbor complaints intensified. One morning I received a call from the HOA office reporting that a neighbor had claimed my outdoor lighting was disturbing their sleep. I laughed at first. My lights were tasteful, soft, ambient, but the complaint triggered another inspection. The HOA representative showed up at sunset, meticulously measuring light intensity, taking photographs, and writing detailed notes as though I were a criminal under investigation. The absurdity of it all became almost comical, yet the stress was very real. I could feel the walls of my own home shrinking around me, my sanctuary invaded not by burglars, but by rules and regulations weaponized against me. Then came the more direct harassment. Notices began arriving in the middle of the night, taped to my door, slipped under the gate, or left on my driveway. Each one escalated the threats, hinting at further fines, legal action, and, eventually, seizure. The tone shifted from bureaucratic to menacing, as though the HOA had grown tired of subtlety. On one occasion, they even sent a lawyer to my home to discuss a violation. Regarding the placement of a small garden statue, the lawyer spoke in careful, threatening terms, emphasizing that failure to comply could result in escalated measures. My anger and disbelief mounted. I had not only followed every rule, but I had been meticulous beyond reason. Yet somehow, it was never enough. The absurdity of their demands collided with reality in ways that made every day a battle. One afternoon, I discovered that a portion of my fence had been tampered with overnight. It wasn't destroyed, just shifted slightly, enough to trigger a violation notice claiming unauthorized structural alteration. I felt the fury rising within me. My property, my home, had become a chessboard for petty power plays, and the HOA were ruthless, calculating opponents who seemed to enjoy testing limits. I documented everything, photographed every inch, recorded every conversation. But the psychological toll was mounting, the relentless harassment leaving me restless, angry, and determined to fight back. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more invasive, they did. The HOA began challenging the very boundaries of my property, questioning surveys, digging up old maps, and hiring inspectors to remeasure every inch. They claimed that part of my land encroached on community property, a preposterous accusation, yet one that demanded a formal response. The tension escalated daily, transforming what had been a peaceful, controlled life into a constant battle of wills. Every trip outside felt like a confrontation, every interaction a potential escalation. I realized that to protect my home, I would need to anticipate their moves before they even made them. One night, as I sat reviewing yet another stack of notices, I received an anonymous tip from a neighbor. They warned me that the HOA board was plotting to leverage obscure clauses in the bylaws to seize my property if I failed to comply with an upcoming inspection. They hadn't yet announced. My blood ran cold. This was no longer about garden decorations or lighting. It was about the very ownership of my home. I realized that their strategy was methodical, strategic, and relentless. They were treating my life like a game, and every move I made was being monitored, cataloged, and challenged. The psychological games continued with increasing intensity. Letters would reference minor infractions from months prior, as though to prove that I was constantly failing to comply. The HOA even suggested that my presence on certain areas of my property at specific times violated vague community guidelines. I started planning my days meticulously, calculating every action to avoid giving them another excuse to escalate. Sleep became restless, mornings tense, and even the calming sound of the ocean began to feel like a mocking soundtrack to their relentless surveillance. Then came a particularly egregious incident. The HOA sent a team to inspect my property during a heavy storm, claiming they were concerned about safety compliance. I watched from inside as they stomped through my gardens, measuring drainage slopes, photographing the deck, and taking notes on the angles of railings. The storm pounded against the windows, wind whipping the trees, but their scrutiny was clinical, almost cruel. I could feel my patience fraying, my anger boiling, and yet I remained calm, documenting everything, knowing that losing control would only give them leverage. Amid this chaos, I began to notice cracks in their unity. Some board members seemed uneasy, hesitant, almost reluctant to escalate further, while others were merciless, pushing the boundaries to see how far I would tolerate abuse. I realized that the HOA wasn't a monolith. They were human, subject to fear, ego, and greed. This insight gave me the first glimmer of hope. If I could play my cards carefully, exploit their overreach, and respond strategically, perhaps I could turn the tables. The harassment wasn't limited to official channels. My neighbors, influenced or emboldened by the HOA's actions, began passive-aggressive campaigns against me. Garden hoses mysteriously tangled, gates left unlocked, minor vandalism of decorations, all small, almost inconsequential acts individually, but together creating a sense of constant violation. Each incident was a reminder that my community, my sanctuary, had become a minefield, where even a single misstep could trigger a disproportionate response from the HOA. And yet, despite the stress, I refused to back down. Every letter, every fine, every inspection hardened my resolve. I began preparing, studying the bylaws, gathering evidence, and devising strategies. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending autonomy, dignity, and the principle that no bureaucratic entity could trample over a law-abiding homeowner without consequence. The psychological toll was immense, but so was my determination. I had to turn this narrative around, and I knew that patience, precision, and timing would be key. The crescendo of tension came when the HOA attempted to schedule what they claimed was a final compliance hearing, hinting, subtly but unmistakably, that my property could be seized if I failed to meet their demands. I stared at the notice, heart pounding, knowing that their eyes were on me, waiting for any slip. It was the ultimate test, a confrontation where one wrong move could cost me everything I had built. Every unfair fine, every petty inspection, every act of harassment had led to this moment, and I understood that I needed a decisive plan. In the days leading up to this hearing, I meticulously prepared. I revisited surveys, reviewed the bylaws line by line, photographed every corner of my property, and documented every communication. My home, once a place of calm, had become a fortress of evidence, a stage where strategy would decide the outcome. I also began monitoring the behavior of HOA members, noting alliances, tendencies, and weaknesses, looking for the exact moment when their overconfidence could be used against them. The tension reached its peak one evening when an HOA representative appeared unannounced, clipboard in hand, ready to conduct yet another inspection. I met them at the gate, calm but resolute, aware that every word, every gesture, was a potential escalation. They began their review, scrutinizing every inch, and I followed, documenting, questioning, and standing my ground. The air was thick with unspoken challenge, a silent battle of wills unfolding as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the ocean with shades of gold and crimson. By the time the final compliance hearing arrived, the HOA had overextended themselves. Their letters, fines, inspections, and harassment had created a mountain of evidence of overreach and abuse. I knew their own rules and procedures were rigid, and their obsession with control had left them vulnerable. It was the perfect storm, a convergence of preparation, patience, and understanding of both the law and human nature. I was ready to confront them, not with anger, but with precision and authority. And as I walked into that hearing, a storm of tension, frustration, and anticipation swirling around me, I understood something critical. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up to intimidation, asserting autonomy, and showing that power, no matter how bureaucratically codified, could be challenged when confronted with strategy, knowledge, and unwavering resolve. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and the next moments would determine not just the fate of my home, but the outcome of a conflict that had pushed me to my limits, tested my patience, and ignited a determination that nothing, no rule, no letter, no petty official, could suppress. The day of reckoning arrived with a tension so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a knife. I stood at the entrance of the OA's scheduled compliance hearing, every step toward the building feeling heavier than the last. Months of harassment, fines, inspections, and psychological warfare had led to this moment. My hands were steady, my mind clear, but beneath the calm surface, a storm of anticipation and determination roiled. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about proving that no bureaucratic body could intimidate a law-abiding resident, no matter how high their claims of authority. And for the first time, I had the upper hand. The room was crowded, unusually so, with a mixture of board members, legal representatives, and a handful of neighbors who had either taken sides or simply come to witness the spectacle. Their expressions ranged from smug confidence to thinly veiled irritation, clearly expecting me to buckle under the pressure. I met their gaze steadily, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. I had prepared meticulously surveys, photographs, correspondence, timestamps, and meticulous notes documenting every instance of harassment and rule overreach. I knew their every overstep would be laid bare, and I intended to make it undeniable. The hearing began formally, with the HOA president reciting the usual litany of supposed violations: unauthorized structures, landscape deviations, lighting infractions, and, most shockingly, hints of seizure threats. Their words dripped with authority, designed to intimidate, to make me feel small in a room filled with their collective power. But I had anticipated every claim. Calmly, I presented my evidence showing photographic timelines, legal surveys, and documented correspondence that exposed the inconsistencies, exaggerations, and outright falsehoods of their accusations. Each time they interjected, attempting to regain control, I countered with precise facts, leaving them increasingly flustered and unable to regain the narrative. Then came the first public humiliation for the HOA. I revealed that several of their so-called violations had been based on misread measurements and outdated maps that contradicted official county records. Murmurs spread across the room as I laid out incontrovertible proof. The pergola that had sparked this entire conflict was fully compliant. My fences were precisely within legal boundaries, and the lighting in question adhered to both HOA and municipal standards. Board members exchanged nervous glances, some whispering, others glowering, realizing that their attempts at intimidation were unraveling before an audience that had now started paying attention. As the tension mounted, I strategically shifted focus to the pattern of harassment itself. I presented the letters, fines, inspections, and even photographic evidence of minor neighbor sabotage, framing it as an orchestrated effort by the HOA to exert power beyond its legal authority. I highlighted instances where representatives had conducted inspections during storms, sent notices at unreasonable hours, and cited obscure clauses with no basis in documented rules. The air in the room grew electric. The board members, once smug, were now on the defensive, struggling to justify actions that had seemed minor in isolation but, when compiled, painted a picture of relentless abuse. Then, in a calculated move that would leave a lasting impression, I revealed my own authority, my role as the local sheriff. The room fell into stunned silence. The very people who had assumed I was just another resident now realized they had misjudged the situation entirely. I explained that while I had tried to resolve this through documentation and reason, the repeated abuse, harassment, and threats against property ownership could not go unanswered. Their overreach had triggered legal consequences far beyond simple HOA enforcement. I could act legally and decisively to ensure my rights, and the rights of any homeowner subjected to similar treatment, were protected. Their discomfort escalated when I systematically dismantled their credibility. I pointed out that several board members had ignored proper procedure, violated their own bylaws, and attempted to leverage ambiguous clauses to intimidate a resident. Each misstep was documented, each overreach laid bare for everyone present. It was no longer a hearing about minor violations. It was a trial of character, competence, and legality. The audience, neighbors, and legal representatives watching began murmuring among themselves, sensing the dramatic reversal unfolding. I could feel the tide turning. The energy in the room had shifted from tension to astonishment. And then came the moment of true confrontation. One of the more aggressive board members attempted to interrupt, trying to assert authority over me, to shame or silence my presentation. I responded calmly, citing their own procedures and bylaws, highlighting how their actions violated both HOA policy and local law. The room seemed to shrink around him as I methodically exposed his attempts to intimidate me. Sweat formed on his brow, his words faltered, and even the most confident members of the board now sat rigidly, caught off guard by the precision of my challenge. For the first time, it was clear they had underestimated not just my knowledge, but my resolve and authority. The legal twists came quickly. I had consulted with attorneys prior to the hearing, ensuring that any overreach could be met with immediate consequences. Each time they tried to invoke a fine, threaten escalation, or manipulate rules, I countered with documented evidence and procedural violations. Board members fumbled, realizing that every action they had taken could be questioned, reversed, or even penalized. Their entire strategy, built on intimidation and assumed superiority, collapsed under the weight of facts, preparation, and authority. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come. The climax of emotional intensity arrived when I revealed the final piece of evidence, a timeline of every harassment, fine, inspection, and neighbor complaint, aligned to show a pattern of abuse, personal targeting, and deliberate escalation. Each entry was corroborated, timestamped, and documented. I described, with calm precision, how these actions had gone beyond ordinary HOA oversight and into territory that could be construed as harassment or intimidation under the law. The room went silent. Board members avoided eye contact, legal representatives nodded grimly, and neighbors whispered among themselves, witnessing a dramatic reversal of power. At that moment, I felt a surge of vindication, a mix of anger, triumph, and relief. The frustration of months, the sleepless nights, the constant stress, the feeling that my sanctuary was under siege, was boiling to a head. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't act rashly. Instead, I let the evidence, my authority, and the undeniable truth speak for itself. The board, once in control, was now defensive, exposed, and cornered. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of panic and realization. The most dramatic twist came when the HOA attempted a last-minute procedural maneuver, trying to assert that I had somehow forfeited compliance by not responding to a minor notice. I calmly presented proof of immediate responses, documented calls, and logged emails, showing that not only had I complied with all legitimate requests, but that their claims were unfounded. Their final gambit failed spectacularly, leaving the board red-faced and the room tense with anticipation of what the outcome would be. By the end of the hearing, the energy had shifted completely. I had turned a situation designed to intimidate and control me into a decisive display of preparation, authority, and resilience. The board members, once smug and confident, now sat silent, each one aware that their strategy had failed. I had not only protected my property, but I had exposed a pattern of overreach and harassment that could no longer be ignored. The weight of months of stress lifted slightly, replaced by the first glimmers of satisfaction and the knowledge that justice, though unconventional, had been served. And yet, even in the triumph, there was a lingering sense of tension. The HOA was beaten, their credibility diminished, but the emotional toll, the erosion of trust within the community, and the damage done to my sense of sanctuary could not be entirely undone. I understood that this confrontation, as intense and satisfying as it had been, was only the turning point, the resolution. The restoration of peace, the emotional closure, and the long-term consequences was still ahead. As I left the hearing room, the murmurs of neighbors and observers followed me, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and quiet admiration. The board members avoided eye contact, aware that their actions had been publicly challenged and effectively neutralized. I felt the weight of responsibility, not just to myself, but to the principle that no individual should be subjected to intimidation under the guise of bureaucratic authority. The storm had reached its peak, the confrontation delivered maximum impact, and yet the story wasn't over. Walking back to my oceanfront property, I reflected on the months of tension, harassment, and absurdity that had led to this moment. Every letter, every inspection, every petty complaint had been a test, and I had passed. But the resolution, the final reclaiming of peace and autonomy, was still on the horizon. The sense of victory was tempered with awareness the HOA had been defeated in this battle. But the war for respect, justice, and the preservation of personal freedom within a controlled environment would require careful attention moving forward. And as I approached my home, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting golden light across the water, I knew that the climax, the moment of ultimate confrontation and reversal, had been achieved. The HOA's overreach had been exposed, their intimidation neutralized, and my authority asserted. Yet the story was not yet complete. The final chapter, the resolution, the long-term consequences, and the emotional closure, was waiting, ready to provide the full arc of triumph, justice, and the lessons learned from a conflict that had tested every ounce of patience, strategy, and resilience I possessed. The storm had passed, and for the first time in months I could breathe. The HOA had been decisively challenged, their overreach exposed, and their authority diminished. The months of letters, fines, inspections, and subtle harassment had culminated in a confrontation that had not only protected my property, but had also set a precedent for fairness and accountability. I walked through my oceanfront home, feeling the weight of tension slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of relief that was almost tangible. The house, the sanctuary I had fought to defend, felt whole again, the light returning to its corners, the ocean breeze carrying a sense of freedom that had been absent for far too long. In the days that followed, the immediate consequences of the hearing became evident. The HOA board, humbled and publicly exposed, began to retreat. Their attempts to intimidate or challenge residents became noticeably cautious, their communications measured and careful. Some members resigned quietly, unwilling to face scrutiny or legal consequences, while others attempted to rebuild credibility with conciliatory gestures. I monitored these developments closely, ensuring that no further attempts to exploit loopholes or enforce dubious fines would occur. The sense of justice was not just personal. It was a message to the community: overreach has limits, and authority, no matter how structured, is accountable. Yet, the resolution was about more than just administrative victories. It was about restoring a sense of autonomy and dignity, not only for myself but for anyone who might face similar challenges in the future. Friends and neighbors reached out, some confessing that they had been silently frustrated by the HOA's tactics but had been too intimidated to speak up. My confrontation, my insistence on evidence, law, and fairness gave them courage. It became clear that one person standing firm could influence the culture of an entire community. The ripple effects were subtle, but significant. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted from fear and compliance to awareness, advocacy, and cautious optimism that residents could defend their rights. The personal impact on me was profound. Months of anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had taken a toll, but the victory reinforced a sense of resilience I had not fully appreciated. I realized that preparedness, patience, and strategic thinking were as crucial as authority. I had learned to anticipate overreach, document meticulously, and respond decisively, all while maintaining composure. The experience transformed my understanding of power dynamics within communities. Rules, regulations, and authority are tools, but when wielded without accountability, they become instruments of intimidation. Standing firm required both courage and intelligence, a balance that ultimately turned the tables. Irony, of course, was abundant. The very organization designed to maintain order and harmony had, through overreach and obsession with control, created chaos and division. Their meticulous rules, intended to ensure uniformity and compliance, had instead ignited conflict, revealing weaknesses and flaws in their structure. The same power they believed would control me had been neutralized by evidence, legal knowledge, and strategic action. It was a reminder that bureaucracy, when unchecked, often undermines its own purpose. The victory was satisfying not merely because it preserved my home, but because it demonstrated that authority, even when codified, must be exercised responsibly. The HOA attempted minor appeals in the weeks following the hearing, but each was met with meticulous documentation and clear legal reasoning. Their attempts to challenge my compliance were systematically dismantled, leaving them with no credible pathway to enforce any of their previous threats. In essence, their power had been recalibrated. The scales of authority, once tilted heavily against me, had finally been balanced. The neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the echoes of the conflict lingered, a reminder to all residents that vigilance and awareness are necessary, even in seemingly peaceful communities. Emotionally, the experience left a lasting impression. There were moments of exhaustion, frustration, and doubt, yet the ultimate triumph reinforced the importance of self-advocacy and resilience. I found that the emotional toll, while significant, was matched by the empowerment that came from standing firm. The process had tested patience, strategy, and resolve to the fullest, but it had also provided lessons in accountability, law, and human behavior. I emerged not only victorious but transformed, more attentive, more deliberate, and more committed to protecting not just property but the principles of fairness and justice. The resolution extended beyond personal victory. Local media, initially indifferent to minor disputes, began to take notice when the HOA's overreach became public. Articles highlighting the absurdity of the fines, inspections, and threats were published, drawing attention to systemic issues in similar communities. This exposure encouraged other residents to examine their own situations and prompted dialogue about the responsibilities and limits of homeowners associations. The broader consequence was a subtle shift in how such organizations operated, with increased transparency, caution, and accountability becoming necessary to avoid scrutiny. In defending my own property, I had inadvertently influenced broader policy awareness. Socially, the aftermath was nuanced. Some neighbors who had aligned with the HOA felt embarrassed, awkward, or defensive, and slowly distanced themselves from overtly aggressive positions. Others expressed gratitude and support, acknowledging that the conflict had been an unfair burden. Community dynamics shifted, not instantly but gradually, toward a more cautious balance of authority and autonomy. The environment that had once felt oppressive began to feel manageable again, though the memory of conflict served as a constant reminder. Vigilance, preparation, and assertiveness are essential when facing bureaucratic overreach. Financially, the resolution was equally significant. The fines that had accumulated during months of harassment were challenged, reversed, or nullified. Any fees assessed unfairly were refunded, and legal counsel confirmed that future attempts to leverage the same tactics would be subject to strict scrutiny. The financial burden of the dispute, though present, had been mitigated, reinforcing the broader lesson that preparation and documentation are invaluable tools for defending against overreach. Property value, long threatened by uncertainty and potential litigation, remained secure, further underscoring the practical importance of a decisive and informed response. But perhaps the most enduring impact was psychological. The months of tension had forced me to confront frustration, helplessness, and anger, but also resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. I had learned to anticipate moves, gather evidence meticulously, and leverage both legal authority and community awareness. The confrontation with the HOA became a personal proving ground, testing not only my rights as a homeowner but also my ability to respond calmly under pressure, think strategically, and assert authority when necessary. These lessons extended beyond property disputes. They were applicable to any situation where power, bureaucracy, and intimidation intersect. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood slowly returned to a peaceful rhythm. Mornings were again filled with the sound of waves, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of seabirds. I walked the paths that wound along the cliffs, once again feeling the freedom and serenity I had fought to protect. The garden bloomed, the deck gleamed, and sunlight streamed through open windows without the shadow of pending inspections or looming fines. My home, my sanctuary, had survived the storm, stronger and more secure than ever. Reflecting on the experience, I realized the lessons were both practical and philosophical. Bureaucracies, no matter how structured, are composed of individuals whose decisions can be influenced, challenged, and held accountable. Authority without accountability is vulnerable to exposure and correction. Preparation, documentation, and strategic action are powerful tools in defending autonomy, dignity, and rights. Most importantly, standing firm in the face of intimidation. Whether from a homeowners association, a bureaucratic system, or any institution claiming authority, can turn fear and frustration into empowerment and triumph. There was also a sense of irony in the aftermath. The organization that prided itself on control, order, and rule enforcement had inadvertently demonstrated the very consequences of overreach: loss of credibility, public scrutiny, and weakened influence. The absurdity of the situation, the constant fines, inspections, and threats, now served as a cautionary tale, a reminder to all that power must be exercised with responsibility, fairness, and respect for those it governs. The HOA had attempted to intimidate, but in doing so, they had exposed themselves to scrutiny, accountability, and ultimately, public embarrassment. Community dynamics evolved as well. Neighbors who had previously been passive began paying closer attention to HOA actions, questioning authority, and documenting interactions. The conflict sparked conversations about fairness, legal rights, and proper procedures, increasing awareness and fostering a sense of collective empowerment. I became, in a way, an unexpected catalyst for change, showing that informed, assertive residents could hold governing bodies accountable without escalating into unnecessary hostility. My struggle had created a roadmap for others facing similar challenges, turning personal conflict into community education and empowerment. The emotional closure was profound. I no longer feared arbitrary fines or inspections. I no longer doubted my ability to defend my property, my autonomy, or my rights. The months of tension and harassment, while exhausting, had forged a deeper understanding of both human behavior and the mechanics of authority. I had discovered an inner reserve of patience, strategy, and resilience that I hadn't fully appreciated before. My home was not just a house. It was a testament to persistence, preparation, and the unwavering commitment to protect what is yours. Looking back, I realized the battle had changed me. I had moved from frustration and helplessness to strategic empowerment, from fear to calculated confidence. The HOA had attempted to control not just my property but my sense of agency, and in defending both, I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resolute. The community had witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority, and I had established that knowledge, preparation, and determination are formidable defenses against intimidation. And yet, there was a lingering lesson in humility. While victory had been achieved, it required patience, attention to detail, and careful navigation of legal and procedural frameworks. There were no shortcuts. No moments of impulsive retaliation could have achieved the same outcome. Every letter documented, every inspection challenged, every conversation strategically navigated had contributed to the ultimate success. The resolution was not just a result of authority, but of thoughtful, deliberate action executed over time, demonstrating that persistence and preparation are key in overcoming systemic overreach. In the end, the property remained mine, intact and untouched by the baseless threats. The garden flourished, the deck overlooked the endless ocean, and sunlight streamed through the windows, untouched by the shadows of intimidation. The HOA, humbled and cautious, had retreated, their credibility diminished, their influence tempered by accountability. The community, wiser and more aware, had observed the power of evidence, preparation, and assertive defense. And I, having faced months of harassment and absurdity, had reclaimed not just my home but my peace of mind, autonomy, and dignity. As I stand now on the patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reflect on the journey, not just the conflict, but the lessons learned. Authority is only as effective as its accountability. Persistence, preparation, and strategic action can turn the tide against intimidation. And even in the face of relentless harassment, maintaining composure and documenting every step can transform vulnerability into empowerment. The story of my home, my fight, and my triumph is a reminder that no one should be passive in defending what is rightfully theirs. So I ask you this: if a seemingly mundane community dispute can escalate to threats, fines, and psychological warfare, how would you respond? Would you stand firm, prepare meticulously, and assert your rights, or would you allow overreach to go unchallenged? The choice, as I discovered, defines not only the outcome, but the very nature of autonomy, justice, and personal freedom. And in that reflection lies the ultimate takeaway, one that every homeowner, resident, and citizen should carry with them as a guide for confronting authority, protecting what is theirs, and refusing to be intimidated by those who mistake power for absolute control.